Welcome back to Telltale Books. I'm talking about a story from the early 1940s by Donald A. Wollheim that has the very simple title of 3 exclamation points. Not the words 3 exclamation points, the actual characters 3 exclamation points. Kind of an interesting story, and it intrigued me, and it was super short. I was putting in Donald Wollheim's bibliography just recently, and I saw this, and so I looked it up in a PDF of stirring science stories for April 1941, and I read this story. Now the story, it's 3 exclamation points, and it's published under the pseudonym of just the letter X, but it is Donald Wollheim that wrote it. Little background here. Donald Wollheim, if you're not familiar with him at all, he was part of the first fandom. He was a science fiction fan in the 1930s. He published a couple of fan magazines, fanzines during the 1930s. What were the titles again? Fanciful Tales of Time and Space in 1936, and then another one called the Fantograph in 1936, and then again from 1942 to 1945. Now, when he reached adulthood, he was writing. And actually, he was born in October 1st, 1914. He died November 2nd, 1990. So in the 1930s, 1939, he was 20 years old. He published his first short story in 1934 in Wonder Stories magazine. The Man from Ariel. Okay, so this was 15 years old. He's publishing his first stories. In 1941, I believe it was, he became editor of Cosmic Stories. And in 1941, he was editor of Stirring Science Stories. And so he embarked on a long career of being an editor of a variety of magazines. Avon Fantasy Reader, Out of This World Adventures, 10-Story Fantasy, Avon Science Fiction Reader. And then he landed a job at Ace Books as an editor, which ultimately in the 1970s led him to found his own publishing imprint, Daw Books, stands for Donald A. Wollheim, which he was in charge of until his death in 1990. And while he was still at Ace, he started editing with Terry Carr a series of annual World's Best Science Fiction anthologies, which ran again all the way until his death in 1990. First under Ace Books, and then when he started Daw Books, he was publishing them under that imprint. So, very, very long time, highly respected editor within the science fiction and fantasy field. Some of the things that he published, Avon 10-Story Fantasy, only lived for a single issue, and it had a really dopey sadomasochistic cover, but it's famous for having been the first publication of Arthur C. Clarke's The Sentinel, which in that magazine was actually titled Sentinel of Eternity, and Clarke later retitled it as just The Sentinel. And he was responsible at Ace Books for the long series of Ace Doubles, and a lot of the authors that got published there. I mean, they published first edition books in paperback of Philip K. Dick, published a lot of Leigh Brackett, published a lot of John Brunner, a lot of early Robert Silverberg. Who else? Lynn Carter published a lot with the Ace Doubles, and under Daw Books he published the long series of Alan Bird Acker's adventures, and pretty much everything by C.J. Cherryh, and authors like Joe Clayton. He put A. Van Vogt back into print, a lot of books by Van Vogt. So, very distinguished editor, very important to the field of science fiction for that contribution. But he's often forgotten about for his own fiction. And that includes me. The only story of his that I've ever read was Mimic, which, by the way, was filmed as a movie in the 1980s titled Mimic. It's a really great science fiction horror film and a really great science fiction horror story. It's been collected in the Great Science Fiction Stories by Asimov and Greenberg. Now, 3 exclamation points was published in Wollheim's own magazine, Stirring Science Stories. And I have a feeling that a lot of Wollheim's earliest stories, he did most of his actual writing of short stories in the early 1940s. And a fair number of it was published in his own magazines under pseudonyms, as well as in his friend Robert A.W. Lowndes' magazines. Lowndes was editing a number of other science fiction magazines in the 1940s, and he again was both a writer and a longtime editor, editing a lot of different science fiction magazines, mostly lesser known magazines like Science Fiction Quarterly. But he still published some terrific fiction. So I think a lot of what Wollheim was writing in the early 1940s was intended to fill magazines that they just weren't able to buy enough stories for, because the magazines that Wollheim and Lowndes were editing were not well-financed magazines. They did not have money to bring in the best authors. Even so, Wollheim, being friends with all the major science fiction authors back then, him and Lowndes and Frederick Pohl were all friends with the likes of Asimov and Kuttner and Hamilton and all the rest of them. So they were able to get some of them to contribute to their magazines, even though they weren't paying as much as Astounding was paying. But I think they still had a lot of pages that would have been empty if they hadn't written their own stories and put them in there under a pseudonym. And I think that's where this story really comes from. But what is 3 exclamation points? The basic, it's told in the first person. There's a narrator talking to somebody. And that somebody is an alien being, an alien scientist who tried to genetically engineer a super race, failed and created a whole bunch of monsters and unleashed them on their planets. So they wanted his head, and he ran and escaped them and ended up on Earth. Okay, that's the basic plot. But I'm giving this top tail status. I'm going to blow this on you. If you don't want this spoiled, then stop now. And trust me that it's worth reading, and I'm giving this one a top tail, even though I wasn't expecting to. It's kind of hokey, but brilliant in the sense that it's kind of experimental and really plays with reality and plays with the whole situation of authors talking to readers through a story in a magazine. Here comes the spoilers. This alien is on Earth, but he has, in changing himself to look like Earthlings, it's affected his mind, and he no longer remembers his past. He thinks he's just another Earthling. So the alien is placing this story knowing that it will appeal to the mindset of this guy. The alien narrator is placing a story in the magazine knowing that it will appeal to this hiding alien and attract him in, to warn him that they are coming for him. So you're reading this, and all of a sudden the story is talking as if you are the alien. And the whole setup, with this alien scientist, his mind is gone and he thinks he's just another human being. It's possible that you really are the alien, and that this story really is a real letter to you being placed by these alien, I guess you'd call them policemen, that are coming after you and trying to talk to you, knowing that you would be reading this particular magazine. Like I say, kind of hokey, but the way Wollheim handles it, and the tone, and just the way the whole story is done, I think it's brilliant. And it's forcing me, like I say, I've only read one other story by Wollheim. He's not really known as an author. He's known as an editor. But I think I gotta read more Donald Wollheim, because the only two stories I've ever read are both great stories in my mind. So I'll leave it at that. If I haven't spoiled it too badly for you, go and read it. Even though I've spoiled it, I think it's worth reading. It's pretty cool. And so I hope you'll read it. I hope you'll come back. Leave comments. Leave comments, even if you're not going to go read it. Like us and subscribe us. Come on back for more videos. I'm going to have a lot more. I don't know if I'm going to do a video on Wollheim again, but I'm definitely going to be reading. And maybe you will too. Good night.